In the shadow of the majestic Cascade Mountains, where the untamed wilderness whispers secrets to the solitary soul, 78-year-old Ellie Morgan had carved out a quiet existence since the cruel hand of fate snatched her beloved husband away 15 years prior. Her humble cabin, perched precariously at the edge of Pinehurst, had stubbornly weathered decades of brutal winters, a testament to Ellie's own spirit. Steadfast, resilient, and unyielding sentinel against the relentless march of time. But destiny, that mischievous weaver of unforeseen circumstances, was about to dramatically alter her peaceful solitude. One fateful spring morning, as the last vestiges of winter's icy grip loosened 4 orphaned bobcat cubs, trembling with vulnerability and radiating an aura of utter helplessness, appeared as if by magic on her very doorstep. These were no ordinary kittens. As they grew, their wild instincts began to surface, forging an extraordinary and deeply emotional bond between them and Ellie, a connection that defied the very laws of nature. Yet as the storms raged outside her cozy cabin, a far greater tempest was brewing within Ellie's own life. She would be forced to summon every ounce of her inner strength, not only to shield her newfound family, but to confront dangers far closer and more menacing than she could ever have possibly imagined. Before we delve deeper into this incredible tale, please, if you haven't already, bestow upon us the gift of your appreciation by smashing that like button. And for more heartwarming stories of resilience and unexpected connections, be sure to subscribe to our channel and ring that notification bell so you won't miss a single captivating narrative. The quaint little town of Pinehurst, nestled snugly in the foothills of the towering Cascade Mountains, was the kind of place where the tapestry of life was woven with threads of familiarity, where everyone knew everyone else's joys, sorrows, and yes, even their little secrets. Time seemed to meander at a gentler pace here, a stark contrast to the frenetic energy of the bustling cities a mere few hours' drive away. At the very edge of this tranquil town, where the smooth asphalt roads surrendered to dusty dirt paths that eventually dissolved into the untamed wilderness, stood a modest cabin that had bravely withstood the onslaught of over 70 harsh winters. This cherished dwelling belonged to Eleanor Morgan, affectionately known to almost everyone as Miss Ellie. At the venerable age of 78, Ellie's face was a roadmap of a life well-lived, etched with deep smile lines that spoke of countless joys and silver strands that she kept neatly contained in a practical braid cascading down her back. Her hands, gnarled yet gentle, bore the indelible marks of decades of hard work, nurturing vibrant gardens, shaping young minds as a dedicated teacher, and simply surviving in a land where nature could be both breathtakingly beautiful and ruthlessly unforgiving. For an impressive 43 years, Ellie had poured her heart and soul into teaching at Pinehurst Elementary, and there wasn't a local family who hadn't entrusted at least one precious child to her care. Ellie hadn't always navigated life's journey alone. She and her beloved husband Frank had lovingly built their life within the sturdy walls of this very cabin, raising their precious daughter Sarah here before she spread her wings and soared to Seattle to become a doctor. The cruel hand of fate had snatched Frank away almost 15 years ago, a sudden and devastating heart attack on a crisp winter morning while he was diligently chopping wood. Since that heart-wrenching loss, Ellie had gradually grown accustomed to the quiet solitude, finding solace in the vibrant hues of her garden, the comforting weight of her well-worn books, and the occasional cherished visits from former students and kind neighbors. You really should consider moving into town. Miss Ellie. Michael Jenkins, the local sheriff, and one of her former students would often suggest, during his monthly check-ins, his voice laced with genuine concern. Or at least think about moving closer to Sarah in the city. Ellie would simply respond with a gentle smile and a knowing shake of her head. This is my home, Michael. These mountains know me, and I know them." Then a mischievous twinkle would dance in her eyes as she added, "Besides, who would keep an eye on all you troublemakers if I left?" What Ellie often kept unspoken was the profound truth that leaving this cabin would feel like abandoning Frank all over again. His presence lingered in the worn wooden floorboards that echoed with their shared laughter, in the familiar creak of the rocking chair, on the porch where they had spent countless summer evenings in comfortable silence, and in the dusty workshop behind the cabin, where his cherished tools still hung in silent anticipation, waiting for hands that would never return. It was the dawn of early April, when everything irrevocably changed. The ground was still damp from the lingering embrace of the last snowmelt, but vibrant patches of wildflowers had begun to bravely emerge, painting splashes of glorious color across the predominantly green and brown landscape. Ellie was in her beloved garden, her hands lovingly preparing the rich soil for her summer vegetables, when the low rumble of an approaching truck broke the tranquil silence. The vehicle that eventually pulled up her long driveway was instantly familiar. A battered green pickup truck that belonged to Jake Thompson Pinerist's dedicated game warden, and yet another former student who held a special place in Ellie's heart. Jake, now in his early 40s, bore the indelible marks of years spent navigating the unpredictable wilderness. A weathered face that spoke of sun and wind, and kind eyes that had witnessed their fair share of both breathtaking wonder and profound tragedy. "Morning, Miss Ellie." Jake called out, his voice carrying a peculiar weight as he climbed out of his truck. Something in his tone, a subtle note of urgency, immediately caught Ellie's attention, causing her to straighten up despite the gentle protest from her aging back. "What brings you out here so early, Jake?" she inquired instinctively, wiping her soil-covered hands on her worn gardening apron. Jake reached into the cab of his truck with deliberate care and gently lifted out a large, sturdy wooden crate. "Found something I thought you might be able to help with," he said softly, setting the crate down with utmost gentleness on the damp ground between them. Ellie peered cautiously inside and felt her heart clench with a sudden wave of profound emotion. Nestled together in the confines of the crate were 4 tiny bobcat kittens, their delicate spotted furs still bearing the soft fluff of youth. Their eyes, an astonishing shade of brilliant blue that would eventually deepen into a golden yellow as they matured, held a mixture of fear and innocent curiosity. They couldn't have been more than a few precious weeks old, their tiny bodies radiating a palpable vulnerability. Their mother was hit by a logging truck up on Ridge Road. Jake explained quietly, his voice tinged with sadness. "By the time I got there, she was gone. Found these little ones nearby in a hollow log. Must have heard the commotion and hidden. Poor little things." "Oh, you poor darlings." Ellie murmured, her hand instinctively reaching into the crate to gently stroke the soft fur of one of the trembling kittens. It responded with a weak hiss, tiny teeth bared in a gesture that spoke more of profound fear than genuine aggression. "What's the plan for them, Jake?" Jake sighed, removing his worn baseball cap and running a weary hand through his already graying hair. "That's the problem. The Wildlife Rehabilitation Center in Portland is completely overwhelmed right now with the early spring influx. They can't take them for at least 2 weeks, and I can't keep them at my place with my dogs." "And you thought of me." Ellie finished for him, her knowing eyes meeting his. Jake had the decency to look slightly sheepish. "You've always had a way with animals, Miss Ellie." He admitted, a hint of a fond smile touching his lips. "And I vividly remember how you nursed that injured hawk back to health when I was in your 4th grade class. These little ones desperately need someone who can feed them every few hours, keep them warm, and not get too attached." He paused, then added with a note of caution, "It would just be temporary. Once they're weaned, they'll go to the rehabilitation center to learn how to survive in the wild." Ellie gazed back at the fragile kittens. They were so incredibly small, so utterly vulnerable without the protection and nurturing of their mother. Their chances of survival in the harsh wilderness alone were virtually zero. She thought about the quiet emptiness of her cabin, the long, silent evenings, and the undeniable void in her life that had never quite been filled since Frank's passing. "Well," she said finally, a hint of a determined glint in her eyes, "I suppose my garden can wait a bit longer. Let's get these little ones inside where it's warm." And just like that, Eleanor Morgan, retired schoolteacher and widow, unexpectedly found herself embarking on the extraordinary journey of becoming the surrogate mother to 4 orphaned bobcat kittens. The first few days were a whirlwind of frantic learning and round-the-clock care. Jake, a constant source of invaluable knowledge and support, brought over special formula from the veterinary clinic in town, along with tiny syringes for meticulous feeding, comforting heating pads, and a well-worn book on the delicate art of wildlife rehabilitation. He also delivered a stern, albeit gentle warning. "Remember, Miss Ellie, these aren't cuddly house cats. They're wild animals through and through. Our ultimate goal is to keep them healthy and strong, but never domesticated. They absolutely need to be able to return to their natural habitat eventually." Ellie nodded solemnly, her gaze fixed on the tiny dependent creatures nestled in a makeshift bed of soft blankets. But deep within her heart, a tender affection was already beginning to blossom for these 4 helpless souls who relied on her so completely for their very survival. Despite Jake's earnest warnings against forming attachments, Ellie couldn't resist giving them names each carefully chosen to reflect their unique personalities. The largest male with his striking reddish fur became Rusty. The smallest, yet surprisingly vocal female was christened Scout. The endlessly curious male, always exploring his surroundings with boundless energy, became Ranger, and the cautious female who observed the world with intelligent, calculating eyes was aptly named Shadow. Every 3 hours, without fail, even in the dead of night, Ellie would meticulously prepare their formula and patiently feed each tiny kitten with the delicate syringe. After each feeding, she would gently clean them with a warm, damp cloth, instinctively mimicking the comforting touch of their mother's tongue. She provided them with a cozy box lined with soft blankets and comforting heating pads, creating a safe and secure den for them in her spare bedroom. As the weeks tenderly unfolded, the kittens grew stronger and more agile. Their eyes, which had initially been that startling, innocent blue, gradually transitioned to a mesmerizing golden yellow. Their soft, downy baby fur began to give way to the more distinctive and beautifully patterned coat of juvenile bobcats. They became increasingly active. Their curiosity knew no bounds, and their playful antics, while endearing, were becoming considerably more destructive. "You should see what they did to my throw pillows." Ellie recounted to Sarah during one of their weekly phone calls, a mixture of exasperation and amusement in her voice. "It looked like it had snowed stuffing in my living room, Mom." Sarah's voice held a note of concern over the phone line. "Are you absolutely sure this is safe? Bobcats are wild animals, Mom. They could seriously hurt you once they get bigger." "Nonsense, dear," Ellie replied firmly, her eyes softening as she watched Ranger stalk and pounce with playful ferocity on a toy mouse she had thoughtfully provided. "They know me. I'm the hand that feeds them." But as the kittens continued to grow, Ellie knew in her heart that Sarah had a valid point. They were becoming significantly larger, their muscles rippling with newfound strength, and their playful wrestling matches were escalating in intensity. When Jake visited after a month, he was visibly impressed by their robust health. but couldn't conceal his growing concern about their comfortable demeanor around humans. They should be showing more wariness. He observed his brow furrowed as Scout playfully batted at his shoelaces with surprising agility. We need to start seriously thinking about transitioning them to the rehabilitation center. A sharp pang of sadness pierced Ellie's heart at the mere thought of relinquishing these precious creatures who had brought so much unexpected joy into her life. But she nodded in reluctant agreement. They need to learn to be wild. She acknowledged, her voice barely above a whisper. But they still seem so young. Jake studied her face, his kind eyes filled with understanding. Then he made a compassionate decision. Let's compromise, Miss Ellie. We'll build a secure outdoor enclosure right here, something that gives them significantly more space and crucial exposure to the natural environment while still keeping them safely contained. You can gradually start reducing your direct interaction with them, and we'll slowly prepare them for the eventual move to the center. With the dedicated help of Jake and a few other trusted community members, all sworn to secrecy about the unusual residents at Miss Ellie's cabin, a spacious and sturdy enclosure began to take shape adjacent to the cabin. It boasted sturdy branches for climbing cleverly concealed hiding places and natural substrate underfoot. The bobcats were carefully moved to their new outdoor home, and Ellie began the difficult and emotionally taxing process of creating distance between herself and the animals she had so lovingly nurtured. She still meticulously prepared their meals, but now it consisted of whole prey items. Initially mice and rats from the local pet store, then gradually larger rabbits as the bobcats continued to grow. She even began wearing a mask when she entered the enclosure to prevent them from associating human faces with the provision of food. She deliberately reduced the amount of time she spent with them, instead observing their activities from the window of her cabin as they enthusiastically explored their new territory, engaged in playful sibling squabbles, and instinctively developed the crucial hunting skills they would need for survival in the wild. But sometimes, in the quiet solitude of the evenings, Ellie would pull up a chair near their enclosure and read aloud from whatever book currently held her interest. The bobcats would often pause in their wild pursuits, their golden eyes fixed on her, as if captivated by the soothing rhythm of her voice. Especially Rusty, who would sometimes lie near the fence, seemingly listening intently to her every word. "I know," she would whisper to them with a sad smile. "I'm probably breaking all the rules, but an old woman gets lonely, and you four have been such good company." Summer eventually graced the Cascades with its warm embrace, bringing longer sun-drenched days and milder temperatures. The bobcats were now adolescents, nearly the size of fully grown house cats. But possessing a lean, muscular build, distinctive tufted ears that gave them a perpetually alert expression, and short, bobbed tails that twitched with focused energy. According to the original plan, they should have already been transferred to the rehabilitation center. However, a frustrating series of unforeseen circumstances, staffing shortages, a lack of available space, and then a devastating forest fire that had tragically displaced a significant number of other wildlife, kept delaying their crucial transfer. "It's not ideal," Jake admitted during one of his increasingly frequent visits, his brow furrowed with concern. "They're getting older, Miss Ellie, and the longer they stay here, the harder it might be for them to fully adjust to a completely wild existence." But Ellie, with her keen powers of observation, honed over years of watching the natural world unfold around her, could see that the bobcats were already exhibiting more pronounced wild behaviors. They were becoming increasingly nocturnal, their movements more secretive and elusive. They would instinctively hide whenever strangers approached the property, and they had even begun successfully hunting live prey that inadvertently wandered into their enclosure. Unsuspecting chipmunks, darting birds, and even a hapless squirrel that had made the fatal mistake of investigating their territory. One evening in late July, as Ellie was carefully carrying their dinner, a plump rabbit for each of them, she noticed something deeply unsettling. The heavy-duty latch on the enclosure door was inexplicably loose, seemingly damaged by a recent violent thunderstorm that had swept through the area, or perhaps by the growing strength and ingenuity of the bobcats themselves. A cold wave of dread washed over her as she immediately grasped the potential implications. The bobcats could easily escape. She stood frozen for a moment, her heart pounding in her chest, then cautiously secured the food inside the enclosure and did her best to repair the damaged latch. Back in the relative safety of her cabin, she immediately called Jake. Her voice trembling slightly as she recounted her alarming discovery. "I'll come first thing tomorrow morning with proper repair materials," he promised, his voice filled with concern. "Do you want me to come over there right now? I could be there in about an hour." Ellie peered out the window at the enclosure. The bobcats were contentedly devouring their dinner, showing no apparent awareness of their potential newfound freedom. "No," she said finally, a sense of weary resignation in her tone. "I think it'll hold until morning. They seem settled for the night." That night, Ellie endured a restless sleep, waking several times to anxiously peer out the window with her flashlight, desperately checking that the precious enclosure still held its wild inhabitants. By the first light of dawn, she was already on her porch, a steaming mug of coffee clutched in her trembling hands, watching the bobcats sleep peacefully in a furry pile in one corner of their enclosure. Jake arrived as promised, his face etched with concern. And together, they meticulously reinforced the enclosure, making it even more secure than before. But the unsettling incident had brought both of them to a stark and unavoidable realization. "It's time, isn't it?" Ellie said quietly as they finally finished the repairs, her voice heavy with a mixture of sadness and acceptance. Jake nodded, his expression sympathetic. "They're ready, Miss Ellie. The rehabilitation center finally has space available, and these four need to complete their crucial journey back to the wild." Ellie knew he was right. The bobcats had transformed so dramatically, not just in their physical size, but also in their wild instincts and behaviors. They were noticeably less interested in her presence, now their attention increasingly focused on the intricate world of scent sounds and the subtle movements of potential prey. They were undeniably becoming what they were always meant to be: independent wild predators. 3 days later, Jake arrived with sturdy transport crates and 2 experienced assistants from the Wildlife Rehabilitation Center. The delicate process of capturing the now wary bobcats was undeniably stressful for everyone involved. Despite having been raised by a human hand, the young bobcats were now exhibiting enough natural caution to resist being handled. It took several tense hours to safely and securely coax all 4 into separate crates. As the last one, Rusty, was finally loaded into Jake's truck, Ellie felt a wave of overwhelming emotion wash over her, tears welling in her eyes. She reached out to gently touch the cold metal of the crate, and Rusty responded with a sharp hiss from within. No longer the helpless kitten she had painstakingly bottle-fed through countless sleepless nights. "It's okay," she whispered, her voice thick with unshed tears, more to herself than to the wild creature within the confines of the crate. "This is how it should be." Jake placed a comforting arm around her trembling shoulders. "You did good, Miss Ellie. You gave them a chance at life when they had none. Now they'll have a chance at freedom, too." Ellie nodded silently, unable to speak past the lump in her throat, as she watched Jake's truck slowly drive away, carrying with it 4 precious pieces of her heart. Autumn descended upon the majestic Cascades, painting the rugged mountainsides in breathtaking hues of fiery gold and vibrant crimson. Ellie's beloved garden had yielded its final harvest, and she busied herself with the comforting rituals of canning plump tomatoes and simmering fragrant apple butter from the small orchard nestled behind her cozy cabin. The days grew noticeably shorter, the nights carried a crisp, cool edge. And soon the first whispers of winter promised a blanket of soft snow and long, quiet evenings. Jake visited occasionally, bringing cherished updates from the rehabilitation center. The bobcats were thriving, growing into their impressive adult size and exhibiting all the appropriate wild behaviors. They were being kept together as a close-knit sibling group, a somewhat unusual arrangement for bobcats, but one that seemed to be working remarkably well for them. The carefully laid plan was to release them into the vast expanse of the national forest, approximately 20 miles from Pinarest, once they were deemed fully ready to navigate the challenges of the wild. The staff says they've never seen bobcats quite like these four Jake shared over a steaming mug of coffee one crisp morning. They're more bonded to each other than typical siblings would be at this age. They even hunt cooperatively, which isn't common behavior for bobcats. Ellie smiled, a warm surge of pride swelling in her chest. They had to depend on each other right from the very beginning, she explained softly, her gaze drifting towards the empty enclosure outside. And they had a human mother who read them far too much Jack London. Perhaps they learned something about pack behavior. Life gradually settled back into its familiar rhythm for Ellie. She found renewed joy in the lively discussions of the local senior center's book club, continued her cherished tradition of baking her famous cookies for the elementary school's fundraising events, and diligently prepared her cabin for the impending arrival of winter's icy grip. She consciously tried not to dwell too much on the bobcats, though their memory lived on in the silent testament of the empty enclosure behind her cabin, a space she couldn't yet bring herself to dismantle. It was the first delicate snowfall of the season, a light dusting that transformed the familiar landscape into a breathtaking winter wonderland overnight, when Ellie received the long-awaited call from the rehabilitation center. The bobcats had been successfully released the previous day in a remote and carefully chosen area of the vast national forest. The release had gone smoothly, all four animals venturing into the silent woods together after a brief, hesitant pause at the open doors of their transport crates. "They're truly wild now, Miss Ellie," Jake told her gently over the phone, his voice carrying a note of quiet satisfaction. "They'll find their own territories, and with a bit of luck, they'll live long, natural lives." Ellie thanked him for sharing the news, a bittersweet ache in her heart. Later that day, she sat on her porch swing, wrapped in a thick, cozy blanket, watching the delicate snowflakes dance in the crisp air. She felt a profound mixture of sadness and a deep sense of satisfaction. The bobcats had been an unexpected beacon of light in her life, a renewed sense of purpose when she had begun to feel that her most useful years were behind her. But they were finally where they belonged, embracing their wild destiny, and that comforting knowledge warmed her heart despite the winter chill in the air. Winter deepened its icy grip on the mountain community, bringing with it the familiar isolation that heavy snowfall often created. Roads became treacherous, sometimes impassable for days on end. And Ellie, a seasoned mountain resident, had diligently stocked her pantry prepared for periods when she might be effectively cut off from the outside world. It was during one such fierce snowstorm, just 3 weeks before the joyous arrival of Christmas, that an unexpected and deeply unsettling trouble found its way to Ellie's secluded cabin. The day had faded into an early dusky twilight, and the wind howled relentlessly around the eaves of the old building, sounding like mournful spirits. Ellie had built a roaring fire in her trusty wood stove and settled into her favorite armchair with a comforting book and a steaming mug of tea when she distinctly heard the sound of a vehicle struggling up her long, snow-covered driveway. Her curiosity piqued. She cautiously went to the window. Through the swirling curtain of snow, she could just make out the indistinct shape of an unfamiliar pickup truck. not Jake's familiar vehicle, and certainly not belonging to any of her known neighbors. In a small town like Pinehurst, Ellie prided herself on recognizing most vehicles on sight. The truck finally lurched to a stop, and two figures emerged, bundled head to toe against the biting cold. They trudged slowly and deliberately toward her porch, and a cold knot of unease tightened in Ellie's stomach. Visitors were rare enough in good weather. In the midst of a raging snowstorm, they were highly unusual, unless it was a dire emergency. Still, years of ingrained small-town hospitality prompted a hesitant response. She opened the heavy wooden door just as they reached her porch steps. "Can I help you?" She called out, her voice slightly strained against the howling wind. The two men looked up, and something in their hard, assessing expressions sent a shiver of apprehension down Ellie's spine. They didn't possess the open, friendly faces of neighbors, nor the worried urgency of people seeking genuine assistance. "Miss Morgan," the taller of the two men, inquired, his voice rough and unfamiliar. He was middle-aged, with a scraggly, unkempt beard and shifty eyes that darted nervously past her into the warm interior of the cabin. "We're with the power company. Got a report of lines down in this area. Mind if we come in and use your phone? Our radio's out." Ellie knew it was a blatant lie instantly. The power was still steadily on in her cabin, casting a warm glow through the windows. Furthermore, legitimate utility workers would undoubtedly have proper identification and clearly marked vehicles with company logos. And they certainly wouldn't have addressed her so formally as Ms. Morgan, like someone who had merely learned her name secondhand. "I'm afraid my phone line is down," she said, her voice remarkably steady despite the growing sense of danger. "Has been since yesterday. You might try the Hendersons about 2 miles back down the road. They have a satellite phone for emergencies." The shorter man, who possessed a lean, almost gaunt appearance and hungry eyes that seemed to devour the contents of her cabin, stepped forward menacingly. "Look, lady, it's freezing out here. Just let us in for a minute to warm up." Ellie's hand instinctively tightened on the cold iron doorknob. "I'm sorry, but I don't know you, and I don't let strangers into my home. There's a community shelter in town if you need warmth." The taller man's face hardened, his polite facade crumbling away to reveal a sinister edge. "I don't think you understand the situation." His hand moved deliberately to his jacket pocket, and Ellie caught the unmistakable outline of a handgun. "We're coming in one way or another." A wave of icy fear washed over Ellie. But decades of managing unruly fourth graders had unexpectedly instilled in her a certain steely resolve, a refusal to show weakness in the face of intimidation. "I understand perfectly," she said, her voice surprisingly calm, despite the frantic beating of her heart. "And I should probably tell you that Sheriff Jenkins checks on me daily in this kind of weather. He's due any minute now." It was another calculated lie. Michael only came by weekly, and he had just visited yesterday. But she desperately hoped it might give these menacing intruders pause, a flicker of doubt that could buy her precious time. The shorter man let out a harsh, mocking laugh. "Nice try, old woman. We know the sheriff's stuck in town with that multi-car pileup on the highway. No one's coming to check on you tonight." Ellie's blood ran cold. They had done their homework. These weren't just opportunistic drifters seeking shelter from the storm. They had deliberately targeted her, her isolated home, her vulnerability. Her mind raced desperately, searching for any possible escape route. Her phone was in the kitchen, frustratingly out of reach. Her late husband's trusty shotgun was locked securely in a cabinet in the bedroom, unloaded with the ammunition stored separately, a safety precaution she had always diligently followed. Neither was within quick and easy access. "What do you want?" she asked, her voice trembling slightly, now stalling for precious time as she frantically tried to formulate a plan. She glanced involuntarily towards the back door, the one that led to her darkened garden and the now empty bobcat enclosure beyond. She vaguely recalled that the latch hadn't seemed quite as secure as usual earlier. Had she inadvertently left it slightly ajar after bringing in firewood? It might offer a desperate escape route if she could create a diversion. "We'll start with whatever cash you have." The taller man sneered, his eyes gleaming with avarice. "Then maybe some of those nice antiques I can see from here. And we know old folks like you usually have good prescription meds." Oker, as he spoke, he pushed forward his imposing presence, forcing Ellie to step back into the unwelcome invasion of her own home. The shorter man followed close behind, slamming the doors shut with a chilling finality, and immediately beginning to scan the cozy living room for anything of value. "The cash is in a jar, in the kitchen cupboard." Ellie said, her voice barely a whisper, desperately hoping that a show of compliance might prevent the situation from escalating into violence. "I don't have much, just emergency money." "Show me," the taller man ordered, gesturing impatiently with the cold steel of the gun, now openly displayed in his hand. Ellie led the way towards the kitchen, her mind still frantically searching for a glimmer of hope, a way out of this terrifying nightmare. As they passed the back door, her heart leapt with a desperate idea. Slowly, deliberately, she reached for a high kitchen cabinet, opening it, to reveal a neat row of her precious canning jars filled with the vibrant colors of her summer harvest. "It's in one of these," she said, her hands shaking now. Not entirely from fear, but with the nascent beginnings of a risky plan. The man stepped closer, his impatience palpable. "Hurry up, Grandma. We don't have all night." As Ellie reached for a jar on the top shelf, her fingers fumbling slightly, she deliberately knocked several other heavy glass jars off the shelf, sending them crashing to the floor in a deafening explosion of shattered glass and the sticky, sweet scent of preserved tomatoes. In the split second of startled confusion that followed the chaotic crash, Ellie bolted towards the back door, throwing it open and plunging headlong into the swirling, snow-filled darkness of her garden. She heard a string of angry curses erupt behind her, followed immediately by the crunching sound of heavy boots pursuing her through the deep snow. At 78 years old, Ellie was no match for younger, able-bodied men in a foot race, especially in the treacherous conditions of deep, unbroken snow. Her only desperate hope was to reach the small storage shed located behind the cabin, a meager structure that thankfully had a sturdy lock on the inside, and a small window she might be able to desperately climb through to circle back towards her truck. She was halfway to the shed, her lungs burning with the frigid air, when her aging foot caught on a hidden root beneath the snow, sending her sprawling face first into the icy ground. A searing pain shot through her ankle as she desperately tried to stand. Not broken, she thought, with a flicker of grim determination, but definitely badly sprained. Behind her, the piercing beams of flashlights cut through the swirling darkness as both men emerged from the cabin, their menacing silhouettes stark against the white landscape. "You're only making this worse for yourself, old woman." The taller one yelled, his voice tight with fury. Ellie tried to crawl towards the relative safety of the shed, but the agonizing pain in her ankle and the deep, unforgiving snow made any progress agonizingly slow. The men's heavy footsteps crunched closer and closer in the snow. This was it, she thought, with a wave of despair. After all these years of fiercely guarding her independence, of stubbornly proving she could manage on her own, she was about to fall victim to the very scenario that Sarah and Michael had so often warned her about. Then, just as despair threatened to engulf her, she heard something else. A low, guttural, rumbling growl emanating from the inky blackness to her right. The sound was primal, instinctual, raising the hairs on the back of her neck despite the immediate and terrifying threat posed by her human pursuers. The men heard it too. Their flashlight beams swung wildly towards the unexpected sound, momentarily illuminating the swirling snow. What the hell was that? The shorter man asked, his voice suddenly laced with uncertainty and a palpable fear. Before anyone could answer, a blur of swift motion erupted from the shadows. Something large and incredibly fast slammed into the shorter man, knocking him off his feet with a startled cry of shock and pain. In the chaotic swinging of the remaining flashlight beam, Ellie caught fleeting glimpses of a tawny, beautifully spotted coat and powerful, agile limbs. A bobcat, but not just any bobcat. This one was large, fully adult-sized, and then, to Ellie's utter astonishment, 3 more shadowy shapes materialized from the darkness, silently circling the 2 stunned men, with low, menacing growls that echoed in the stillness of the snowy night. The taller man, his face a mask of disbelief and terror, fired his gun wildly into the darkness. The bright muzzle flash briefly illuminated the unbelievable scene in stark detail. 4 magnificent adult bobcats positioned strategically around the terrified humans, their eyes reflecting the light like glowing golden lamps. "Jesus Christ!" he shouted, firing another panicked shot that whizzed harmlessly through the snow-filled air, backing away clumsily towards the relative safety of the cabin. "Get these things away from us." The shorter man was struggling to his feet, clutching his arm, which was now visibly bleeding from what appeared to be deep claw marks. "Let's get out of here," he yelled, abandoning any remaining thought of robbery in the face of this utterly unexpected and terrifying threat. Both men retreated hastily towards their truck, one firing another wild warning shot that went wide, the other stumbling and slipping in his desperate panic. The 4 bobcats followed, not attacking directly now, but maintaining relentless pressure. Their silent presence ensuring the intruder's hasty retreat continued. Ellie watched in stunned disbelief as the 2 men scrambled into their pickup truck. The engine roared to life, tires spinning wildly in the snow, and they backed down her driveway at a dangerously reckless speed, narrowly avoiding a collision with a snow-laden tree before finally disappearing into the swirling darkness of the snowy night. An eerie silence descended, broken only by the mournful howl of the wind and the soft, almost silent padding of paws in the snow. Ellie suddenly became acutely aware of her own vulnerable position, lying injured and exposed to the biting cold. The bobcats had miraculously chased off the intruders, but they were, after all, wild predators. Would they now turn their attention to her, seeing her as easy prey in her weakened state? Slowly, cautiously, she pushed herself up to a sitting position, a sharp jolt of pain radiating from her injured ankle. The biting cold was beginning to seep through her layers of clothing. The 4 bobcats had gathered a short distance away, their inscrutable yellow eyes fixed intently on her. "Well," she said aloud, her voice shaking slightly from a mixture of shock and the encroaching cold, "I suppose I should thank you, whoever you are." One of the bobcats stepped forward, the largest male with distinctive reddish markings that stirred a powerful and deeply emotional memory within Ellie. He approached her slowly, stopping just a few feet away. He lowered his head and sniffed the air around her, then made a soft chuffing sound that seemed almost like recognition. "Rusty," Ellie whispered, hardly daring to believe the impossible. "Is that you, boy?" The magnificent bobcat tilted his head, his intelligent golden eyes seeming to lock with hers. And in that extraordinary moment, defying all logic and the established principles of wildlife biology, Ellie was absolutely certain. These weren't just any wild bobcats. These were her bobcats. Rusty, Scout Ranger, and Shadow. Somehow, against all odds, they had found their way back to the place where they had been given a second chance at life, back to the human who had saved them when they were helpless, vulnerable kittens. "You impossible creatures," she said, tears freezing on her cheeks. In the bitter cold air, her voice thick with a profound and overwhelming emotion. "You're supposed to be 20 miles away in the national forest." Rusty took another tentative step closer, then another, until he was near enough that Ellie could feel the comforting warmth radiating from his powerful body. He gently sniffed her outstretched hand, then turned his head and made a soft, communicative sound to the others. To Ellie's utter amazement, the other 3 bobcats moved closer, forming a loose, protective circle around her injured form, their sturdy bodies creating a small but significant windbreak against the relentless driving snow. Understanding, profound and deeply moving, dawned in Ellie's heart. They weren't going to harm her. Somehow, against all scientific predictions and the vastness of the wilderness, these wild animals remembered her. More than that, they were protecting her, emboldened by their unexpected presence and their seemingly protective intent. Ellie spoke again, her voice gaining a touch more strength. "I need to get back to the cabin," she said, as if they could understand her every word. "My ankle really hurts." She began the painful process of trying to stand using a nearby snow-laden tree for support. The bobcats watched her every move, their alert eyes following her, but they didn't interfere. Once she was precariously upright. Balancing on her good foot, she began to hop awkwardly towards the distant glow of her cabin windows, using trees and sturdy shrubs for balance wherever she could. The 4 bobcats moved with her, staying close, but never touching, maintaining their silent, watchful, protective formation. It was slow and agonizing progress through the deepening snow. But eventually, Ellie reached her back porch, the familiar scent of wood smoke, a comforting beacon in the cold night air. The porch steps presented a significant challenge with her injured ankle. But with a determined grunt, she managed to pull herself up using the sturdy railing. She paused at the door, her breath catching in her throat, and looked back. The 4 bobcats sat in the snow, their golden eyes reflecting the soft glow of her porch light, watching her with an unwavering intensity. They made no move to follow her inside, seemingly understanding that the human dwelling wasn't their territory. "Thank you," she said simply, her voice thick with emotion. "You saved my life tonight." She hobbled inside her injured ankle, throbbing with each step, and immediately called the sheriff to report the attempted robbery and the unbelievable intervention of her wild protectors. As she waited for help to arrive, she kept glancing out the window, half expecting the bobcats to disappear back into the vast wilderness. But they remained settled in the snow around her cabin, like silent, watchful sentinels. When Sheriff Michael Jenkins finally arrived the next morning, having battled through snow-blocked roads with a deputy and the town doctor, he found Ellie safe and sound in her cozy cabin, her ankle carefully wrapped, and an incredible story to tell. "Bobcats," he repeated skeptically after Ellie had recounted the previous night's astonishing events, his brow furrowed in disbelief. "You're saying 4 bobcats chased off armed robbers?" "I know how it sounds, Michael." Ellie admitted, a wry smile playing on her lips. "But I'm not senile yet. Look at the tracks in the snow if you don't believe me." The sheriff and his deputy dutifully investigated the area around the cabin and found compelling evidence supporting Ellie's extraordinary tale. They discovered the distinct footprints of 2 men running back towards where tire tracks indicated a vehicle had been parked, and unmistakable bobcat tracks circling the area. They even found a disturbing patch of blood in the snow that clearly didn't belong to Ellie, supporting her claim that one of the men had been clawed in the chaotic confrontation. "I'll be damned," Michael said when he returned inside, shaking his head in bewildered amazement. But why would wild bobcats defend a human? It goes against everything we know about their behavior. Ellie exchanged a knowing glance with Jake, who had arrived shortly after hearing about the incident on the police radio. They had never fully explained to the community the incredible events that had unfolded at Ellie's cabin the previous spring and summer. Perhaps they realized it was finally time to reveal the whole unbelievable truth. Maybe. Jake suggested cautiously over a steaming mug of coffee. Maybe they weren't entirely wild. They proceeded to explain the full astonishing story to the bewildered sheriff. How Ellie had lovingly raised the orphaned bobcat kittens, how they had been carefully rehabilitated and eventually released back into the wild. And how against all scientific odds and expert predictions, they appeared to have found their way back to the place they associated with safety, warmth, and unwavering care. They remembered you, Michael. Jake said, his voice filled with wonder. After all those months in the wild, and they remembered the human who saved them, and they returned the favor, it seems. It seems that way. Ellie agreed softly, her eyes shining with unshed tears, though any wildlife biologist would probably tell you it's utterly impossible. Well, Michael said, a slow smile spreading across his face. I've lived in these mountains my whole life, and I've learned that impossible is just a word people use when they can't explain something. Chop. In the days that followed, as news of the incredible incident spread like wildfire through the small, tight-knit community of Pinterest, people began to report occasional sightings of bobcats near Ellie's property. They never approached any other humans and fled if anyone tried to get too close. But they remained in the vicinity, establishing a territory that remarkably happened to include the cozy cabin of a certain elderly schoolteacher. As for Ellie, she finally, albeit reluctantly, agreed to Sarah's repeated suggestions to install a state-of-the-art security system. Though she insisted with a mischievous twinkle in her eye that she already had the best protection any mountain resident could possibly ask for. She also adopted a large, gentle dog from the county animal shelter, not for protection, she claimed, but for companionship. The bobcats, surprisingly, seemed to accept the dog's presence with cautious tolerance, perhaps understanding on some instinctive level that it was now part of Ellie's extended unconventional family group. When spring returned to the Cascades, bringing with it a vibrant tapestry of new wildflowers and the promise of longer sun-drenched days, Ellie would often sit on her porch in the evenings, her loyal dog at her feet, watching the breathtaking sunset paint the sky in a kaleidoscope of colors. Sometimes, as twilight settled over the rugged mountains, she would glimpse fleeting shapes moving at the very edge of the surrounding forest. The silent, watchful forms of her bobcats going about their wild lives, but never straying too far from the cozy cabin where they had once been given a second chance at life.